The world needs heroes. Individuals with the drive and talent to rise above all others. Using sheer force of will to change what's possible. But at Swift, we know every success story has a team behind the scenes. Because for the last 50 years, we've been supporting your success stories, keeping the world connected across more than 200 countries, delivering with excellence built on trust, giving you the latest tools to make transactions instant and frictionless, helping value flow where it's needed, and innovating as technology and society changes. We're making finance a simple, seamless, and standardized part of our lives, and keeping complexity behind the scenes. So whatever your next challenge, we'll be here for you. Whether that's financing global enterprise or helping small businesses thrive. Because with best-in-class infrastructure, we are your support team, helping you achieve the heroics that move our industry forward. Swift, shaping the future of finance together.
All right, welcome. That's a very inspirational video to kick it off. So I'm Chermaine Lee, Securities Go-to-Market Director at Swift, and today we'll be speaking about the topic du jour, of course, T+1 migration, which is happening in just over a week's time in the North American markets. And I'm extremely excited to be joined by my guest speakers today, David Travers and Karen Webb. So maybe you guys, if you could tell us just a bit about yourself, just to kick it off.
Yeah,
David?
look, I'm David Travers. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Custodial Services Association. We represent the interests of the global custodians in the Australian market, focused on best practice and efficiency, as well as market advocacy.
Karen? Thanks.
Hi
And
everyone, Karen Webb. I'm the Head of Issuer Services at ASX in our Securities and Payments division. That is the division that looks after, amongst other things, equities, clearing and settlement, as well as issuer services in our market. So we are a centralised service in doing that across a number of exchanges that are represented in Australia. So I've been with ASX for over 20 years across quite a number of roles, and really keen to talk about T+1 as I was intimately involved in our transition to T+2 in 2016.
all right. So before we get into all the exciting discussion, it's great to see so many of you joining us here today. Of course, feel free to ask questions in the LinkedIn live stream. We'll try to answer them towards the end and try to answer them as best as we can. So just to set the scene before we kick off the questions. So of course, everyone knows T+1 migrations happening globally, first in North America at the end of next week. And of course, the UK as well, aiming to move to T+1 no later than end of 2027. So from our Swift data as well, we see in Asia Pacific currently about 50% of investment and settlement activity directed to North American markets. And while in Australia, that figure is slightly lower at around 30%, but of course, fairly sizable. And of course, that's why we are discussing this topic today. But of course, on the bright side, we have seen some automation and innovative solutions being developed. So, example, DTCC's Match to Instruct. And of course, some custodians have offered their customized FX solutions to get around pre-funding in India. And for Swift, we have also similarly developed some tools to help our users with T+1 migration. So firstly, with GPI, in terms of the real-time tracking of cross-border payments. And of course, the new service, Swift Securities View, underpinned by the unique transaction identifier UTI, where we are enabling global investors to track their cross-border security settlement transactions and rectify, potential issues with the settlement earlier to enable higher potential of settlement success. So we'll speak about some of these automation solutions a bit later. So from Australia's point of view, we are investigating, and we'll speak about that later as well, the benefits and implications of moving to T+1. Although it's already at T+1.5, I think, Karen, you will agree with the batch settlement at 11:30 a.m. So we are very efficient already. But of course, we will discuss more of that in some of the questions right now. So the first question, David, you're the only gentleman or man on the panel. So let's start with you. What are the greatest challenges for Australian investors or even New Zealand as well regarding the move to T+1 in the US?
Thanks, Chermaine. And before I start, I also want to thank Swift for inviting ACSA to be part of the event. We really appreciate that. And my response is really going to focus on the approaches that custodians in Australia and that it also relates to New Zealand are taking to connect their local clients into their global frameworks. Generally, the greatest challenge to T+1 in US, Canada, and Mexico for custodians and investors in Australia is preparedness. And from feedback that I've received, custodians and their clients have been engaged around T+1 for many months. And there's also been a lot of increased engagement as we head towards next week, as you can imagine. And the custodians in Australia do have concerns about the expected increase in failed trades and how that is managed effectively from the Asia Pacific time zone. On preparedness, that can really be broken down into a couple of buckets. Investors seem to be struggling in preparing for T+1, particularly with the potential of funding mismatches across markets and time zones. Firms seem to be revising their operating procedures ahead of T+1, and I understand that there's probably more changing processes taking place than the deployment of automated solutions as we head into that next week. And more investors and brokers also seem to be using automated matching engines as their main way of preparing for T+1 in the market here. And finally, the bucket there is that overseas investors from Australia really need to change their FX processes for T+1, mainly to execute at the same time as the security leg, which before they would have had some buffer in there. This is cultivating a number of other risks as we come towards next week. Certainly on the securities lending side, it's expected that not all the market participants are going to be ready to recall in line with the deadlines, which will put pressure on failed trades. We're sensing that smaller firms are not necessarily as engaged as the larger firms into the needs around T+1. We do understand that exception handling is mainly going to be managed through phone and email, which will put pressure onto existing operational teams. And we also expect that some of the T+1 projects, won't be fully finalised as we head into next week as well. And I think it's fair to say that what we're seeing is that custodians are generally more prepared than some of the brokers, who are probably more prepared than the investors. We also see some practical issues for custodians and their clients to manage, such as will they have enough people available on the implementation to manage the exceptions and fail increases? And are funding lines going to be suitable and appropriate to cater for any unexpected changes that come from the conversion and implementation of T+1?
All right. So many challenges. So of course, Karen, I'm sure some of that feedback has got you thinking on the implications on investors and participants if the Australia market does a similar migration. So what would you say are the biggest considerations that have been raised by your participants thus far for Australia to move to T+1?
Yes, of course. I'd like to start by outlining that while we play a central role in the Australian market, providing clearing and settlement services, we very much see this as a decision that needs to be made by the industry. Because we have so many different key stakeholders that we interact with in that service, they've all got different views, and we've also got our financial market regulators. So we've been leading that discussion in the market, and for stakeholders, it also is a question of whether they're focused domestically or they do have international operations. So the concerns are varied, but just to give you some examples of the types of concerns that have been raised to date, it's really about the timing of the change and what would be the cost of the implementation for each of those organisations. how does it fit in with broader industry change and also each of those organisations' own change programs? And would the apparent benefits from moving to T+1 settlement actually outweigh the costs that everyone will incur? And David's rattled off a large list of change that's going in place ahead of the US change. So that's very practical. So we've sought preliminary views from our stakeholders, and I think overall everyone sees this as a much bigger uplift compared to the T+2 change. So we need to consider it really carefully. And I just wanted to mention that we have actually just published a white paper to the market to really talk about the considerations for each stakeholder, inviting feedback on that point. What could be the potential impact, potential benefits, and again, timing considerations. So we're really keen to see the feedback from our market around those points, and feedback's due June. Thank you.
All right, and given you mentioned the white paper, so maybe we'll talk about some timelines. Given we are less than a week out from the North American migration, so we can't escape the elephant in the room. When everyone, I'm sure, is asking you about that, about when ASX or Australia will move or jump on the T+1 bandwagon. So, do you have an estimate of when that will happen, and how is that decision being made?
Yeah, we don't have an estimate yet or a clear view on the timing. We'd like to concentrate on getting that feedback on the considerations firstly, to see if everyone thinks it's a good idea or not, and then talk to the timing perspectives. But I think it's really having the view that yes, there is global pressure, more and more markets moving to T+1, but it needs to be an Australian decision as well. What's best for our market. So we outlined a few approaches that could be put in play for the move to T+1, whether we do some preparation for that in advance rather than a big bang type approach. And there's also the consideration we have for our very near neighbour, New Zealand. When we moved to T+2, we did coordinate the change with them and also with our debt markets, and all stakeholders have given us the feedback that we should have a coordinated change again. So not clear on timing yet, but we're watching what's happening with interest in North America, and that will feed into some of those considerations.
Okay, so probably not next year, would say, right?
No, I'd say not.
It's a good. We got some time. Got some time to prepare. Um, so maybe we'll also and David, you touched a bit about this just now in your response. So when we speak about security settlement, the payment and funding aspects are sometimes overlooked, right? They look more on the delivery of the security. In a T+1 environment, though, especially for cross-border transactions, and you touched upon this, the funding aspects or the funding gap can be quite significant. Um, and so what do you think the impact would be for cross-border settlement transactions and the related FX settlement?
Yes, I think there's two parts to focus in this response. One is around, just following on from what Karen was saying about T+1 in Australia, and then I'll talk also a little bit about what's happening as we go into the changes next week in the North American markets. But just firstly on Australia, I think for payments and funding aspects of an Australian migration are going to be really important to be considered, and the ASX consultation paper should draw out a lot of the matters that the market needs to be considering as we move from effectively what is a T+1.5 market to a T+half market if we don't change the current settlement time in the market in Australia. And changing that settlement time of 2:30 to potentially a later time, or having multiple times, does have issues around the liquidity and funding that takes place between the participants with CHESS, and obviously feeds very closely into the banking system. So I'm sure the payment system should be able to deal with any changes that we propose, but we need to make sure that we're not unexpectedly impacting liquidity in a negative manner. To talk about what's happening as we go in the North American markets, I think from a trading perspective, there's several trade types that have changing requirements, and therefore the risk frameworks as T+1 kicks in start to be having to be considered more thoroughly. And some of those are around things like ETF trading and the mismatches that will happen between potentially ETFs traded in Australia versus backing into the US market. Back-to-back trades across markets and different time zones will certainly be more challenging, as will block trading and program trading. And I mentioned securities lending before, which will certainly be a challenge. On some of the funding side, there was a recent IFMA report that estimated that roughly 40% of daily FX flows, representing between 50 and 70 billion US, will no longer be able to settle through the CLS platform, obviously resulting in increased liquidity and funding risks to participants. And that number doesn't include the trade flow generated from APAC. And CLS has also announced that it will not make any changes to the current FX settlement cutoffs after discussion with members, really determined that to accommodate a change would, take a significant amount of time to implement. So the ability to use CLS will ultimately require asset managers to use costlier and riskier alternatives, including pre-funding, and creates inefficiencies in the use of capital as we're moving towards the T+1 frameworks. An example of impacts that investors are dealing with on cross trades, and this is probably fairly common knowledge out there, but if you're selling in the Australian market, which will still be 2+2, but you're buying in the US, which will be T+1, there's obviously a mismatch on the funding needs and market exposures that investors are going to have to manage very closely with their custodians to ensure that the settlements can be settled in the appropriate time frame. Also, Australian investors are going to need to potentially fund those US trades through some sort of foreign exchange transaction. If that's to happen on a Friday, then the Australian or Asia, New Zealand client is going to have some sort of shift running on a Saturday morning, and that might be needed to manage the exposures that come off over that Friday settlement. And consideration really needs to be given to the liquidity in the US market that might be happening on Friday afternoons versus other times in the day when more liquidity might be available to meet the needs of the investors in Australia and New Zealand.
And nobody works on Saturday mornings in Australia, right? So we'll have an
That's
issue.
right.
Yeah. So no, very very interesting. Topic. We had a panel just about a month ago, and they were speaking about the positives on this, right? Potential arbitrage opportunities because of the mismatch. So there are benefits that some providers can get out of the funding gaps. But of course, this is a huge concern. I mean, from Swift's point of view as well, when we speak to our customers, the FX settlement is one of the biggest risks that they see for the move to T+1, especially when they deal with cross-border transactions. And maybe for the next question, of course, we've spoken a lot about all the negatives about the T+1 migration, about all the challenges and risks. So let's now focus on what the more positive aspects are of such a change. So we've seen some benefits mentioned, such as reducing margin and capital requirements, of course, in India, who went live early last year, and faster receipt of cash and securities, and reduction in counterparty risk being mentioned in the context of this T+1 changes. So what are the main benefits then for Australia to move to a T+1 settlement cycle? Or is it just because of the pressure from global markets, right? What are the specific benefits for Australia? So Karen, if you could help to answer this based on, of course, your industry consultation thus far.
Sure, and the themes are quite similar, and of course there will be benefits to some in the industry and broader benefits overall for the market. So let's focus on the benefits that have clearly been called out in North America. They were taking an approach to reduce risk. So if you reduce the settlement timeframe, you're going to reduce the risk and risk management perspectives associated with clearing and settlement. And that plays out financially, particularly for our clearing participants. So our clearing risk team have actually done some analysis based on historical data over about a 3-year time frame, running the scenario as if it would be T+2 instead of T+3. And on average, we can see that the cash market margin could be reduced by 40% across the industry. And that might sound significant, but it actually doesn't play out in a dollar term saving of too much to each participant, just based on the numbers that we capture in margins each day. And we're yet to do further analysis on whether there would be any further capital savings to those participants as well. But so that potentially some financial savings for clearing participants, reducing risk overall. The other benefits really are for investors and their counterparts. It's the outcome of the settlement being received more quickly, and we would expect that would help with further liquidity in the market. Of course, there's the push for further automation and innovation to meet those timeframes. We hear it's been a mixed approach in North America, whether it's been a technical change or more people supporting the change, but we would hope it would drive some further innovation in the market as well. And then, of course, ultimately an alignment with global markets. We do have to deal with time zone issues here, being one of the first markets to open during the time zone, and we don't actually overlap key markets like Europe and the US, so time zone continues to be an issue for us anyway. Now, I don't want to be negative on the next point, but Chermaine, you did mention our low fail rates. We do have very low settlement fail rates. They're around 0.3% on volume basis and 0.1% on values, and we're very proud of those rates. We do have penalties for participants that do fail, so we don't want to jeopardise that efficiency in the market either. So that's one of the key considerations for us.
All right. Yeah, I guess it's balancing the cost and benefit, as you mentioned right before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. David, if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chermaine. And look, I think Karen has touched on a lot of points that ACSA sees as being the benefits around the move to T+1, and we've done a little bit of early thinking about it. And just on the point of the low fail rates in Australia, I think that's why the consultation that's underway at the moment is so important for the market to really identify, why the Australian market should be moving to T+1. And I think in the past we may have got a bit caught on the when and the how we should move to T+1 without necessarily understanding the real need for the market to move there. So we're really encouraged that this consultation will help to strategically position Australia on where it needs to be for T+1. But look, some of the ACSA has certainly identified several key benefits that, some of them are similar to what Karen's mentioned, but certainly counterparty risk reduction. Custody clients are grappling with the counterparty risk for a 2-day settlement period, and the reduction obviously helps to mitigate some of that risk. We see benefits around enhancing efficiency and real-time communication as we take some of the timeline out of the settlement process. There's also a tremendous opportunity here to standardise and move to best practice solutions because that will be absolutely needed for the market to deal with the compression. And as I said previously, potentially a move to T+1 in Australia is really a move to T+1/2 or a 3/4 or some other timeline that the market might determine. There'll certainly be the liquidity and funding benefits that Karen mentioned, and also operating model optimisation will really help throughout the whole value chain. As I think it's an opportunity for Australian investors to align to some of the global standards, and that global alignment will also enable some re-engineering to take place around the technology that's utilised. In the custodian's cases, it's really leveraging a lot of the global technology that's being utilised as more and more markets globally move towards T+1.
All right. So is staying on T+2 an option? I believe some people will be interested to know this. Maybe Karen.
I think the market's seen it as an inevitable change. It's probably nutting out those considerations and then thinking about when. So it's a balanced approach, but I think we will have to move at some stage.
Okay, good, honest answer. Yeah, we've got a question from the audience. Maybe we'll ask it since we know we've been speaking quite a lot, amongst ourselves. I might be saying it wrong, but Sachin Yadav, he asks, he's interested in knowing how buy-ins are going to impact T+1, or how they will be impacted by T+1. I'm not sure if any of you might have an idea. David, you did mention a few implications on recalls and securities lending.
Yeah, I don't know exactly which market the buy-ins are in reference to. We don't necessarily have a lot of buy-ins happening in the Australian market. I mean, the settlements tend to be rescheduled, and there may be claims that get dealt with on the back of that. In the US market is from my understanding kind of similar. So, but really, the biggest challenge for the Australia, New Zealand, and Asia Pac investors is really the timelines and the differences. So, if there is a potential that some sort of buy-in situation could take place, the challenge for investors and the custodians that have presence in Australia and Asia Pacific is really about having people available to deal with those challenges. And I know a lot of the custodians in Australia are looking to leverage their global operating models. Most of them already have teams in place in North America, because most of them are North American businesses. And a lot of them also have 24/7 type teams operating out of global operating centres across Asia as well, which would also be utilised to assist with any of those situations.
Right. And Karen, do you have a take on it for Australia or for
Uh,
buy-ins?
as David mentioned, it's a market activity. The central clearinghouse doesn't really have that activity in its domain.
Sure. Um, and let's move on also to talk about a bit, and I mentioned this before, about technology solutions and automation being developed to aid the T+1 migrations and counter all the challenges and risks we've spoken about. Of course, I mentioned again, for Swift, we are engaging with our global community in adopting the unique transaction identifier UTI as a means to enable end-to-end post-trade transparency, which can increase settlement efficiency, as we've spoken about before, and reduce settlement unmatched and failure rate. So, David, maybe, and you've spoken a bit about this, but maybe just to reiterate what technology and automation measures should be considered to cater for T+1 migrations.
Yeah, look, I guess I'd start by saying I'm not necessarily directly involved in discussions with the custodians and their technology stacks. The information I've had received and played out in recent surveys is generally that custodians are ready and have been engaging with their clients. And on the investor side, middle offices are certainly under pressure to deal with the outcomes of trading decisions, and a lot of efforts going into trade matching type solutions there. Especially to deal with the cross-border activity. And as I noted, the key areas for preparedness are around availability of funding, changes to process, middle office preparations, and FX processes. However, look, a fundamental issue concerning custodians in Australia for T+1 is the inability to match trades without an irrevocable settlement obligation attached. And today this is managed in the T+2 environment, but will become increasingly an issue with the compressed timelines unless there's a two-step matching process for trade allegations and confirmation for settlement when the funds and shares are actually in the client's accounts. The ASX white paper is obviously seeking feedback on this. I think will be one of the key areas that comes back from the custodians, and this will likely define specific system changes and technology needs and processing enhancements that are going to be needed by individual custodians. And as all custodians are global, the model for their technology decision comes from the technology and solutions that are used offshore. So it will play into that approach by individual ACSA members as they look at what's needed for T+1 in Australia. And it's unlikely that there will be a mandated technology that ACSA would mandate on its members holistically. As for UTI, this is obviously a great aspiration for the market, and ACSA members understand and see the opportunities it has to bring efficiencies in the trade matching settlement area. And ACSA members are challenged in inconsistencies in the trade flow between custodians and their clients and the market. And for example, not all ACSA member clients are members of SWIFT, and they utilise different ways to instruct trades, whether that be through API or other proprietary type channels. So that may limit the full benefit of UTI if it's not built into some of those other alternative processes. And also further to my comment on global systems, I think ACSA members are part of global banks, and the technology stacks are driven globally. So UTI, if that is focused on globally, I think that would flow back into the local market if it can get the right uptake through the global custodian banks technology areas.
Yeah. Who are these members that are not part of SWIFT? We must
Well, probably
reach
a
out.
lot of them are fund managers, I'd say, that are instructing the custodians or even the super funds. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand. So Karen, given that your investors and participants will have to cope with tighter cutoffs, so what solutions are ASX looking at to help your community, and also maybe if you can speak a bit more about how ASX is planning to support the UTI and transaction identifiers in general? Yeah.
Yeah, through working on our white paper to the market, we actually put together an industry working group which included representatives from the market across participants, share registries, industry associations, other market operators, and so on. And that brought to light some of these considerations about what else we could do to facilitate the change. I mentioned that we see this as needing a bigger uplift. And David mentioned some of this activity. So, yes, we have outlined some of these factors in the paper where we may need further identification of transactions to help that matching process to really facilitate everyone getting to that settlement stage much more quickly. We don't have the solution yet for what those identifiers might be. It could be UTI, it could be something else. So we'll see how that pans out. And there's a few other things as well. We don't have a centralised securities lending solution here in Australia. It's very bilaterally based in the market. And again, considerations around how do we make that facility work a bit more effectively in the market to make sure everyone meets their timeframes, and whether we need to step in, ASX, to help centralise that a bit further. And then there's also the considerations of how we can help participants with providing information much more quickly from trade through to the settlement date to help them get ready. So a lot of our processing at the moment is batch overnight processing. We might have to think about how we bring some of that forward so those information flows work more effectively. So again, we're really interested in feedback from the market, but that working group has already given us some really good pointers on those fronts. And just to mention UTI, it doesn't mean we're not using it at all. Our fixed interest market, which is based on Austraclear, is actually introducing UTI in a new message later this year. That's an MT5788 to support settlement allegements. It's an optional field, but the first step in for us into providing UTI information back to participants to help that process.
Excellent. I believe it's the first in Asia as well to support the UTI, so we're quite excited. Yeah. We actually have two questions. So from Mohammed, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Ayaz Khan. So he asked, in what ways might the adoption of T+1 settlement enhance global market integration, and what are the potential obstacles for smaller firms in implementing this change? I believe, David, if you want to talk about the smaller firms, maybe.
Yeah, look, I think the smaller firms versus the larger firms really comes down to resource capacity and the bandwidth that different teams have to focus on, the process changes that are needed for T+1. So, it's obviously been a large project, particularly those that are focused on North America, and I think the same challenge will happen in Australia when we look to. If the migration is going to happen in Australia, the challenge will be how you balance resources looking at T+1 and process changes and automations that need to happen around the movement in the market here. At the same time, it's likely that it'll be closely aligned to the CHESS replacement project in some way. So it's going to be similar resources working on the same project, and smaller organisations will just have less bandwidth to be able to deal with those situations.
Sure. And then one other question, how does T+1 affect securities lending and borrowing activities, and what strategies can market participants employ to manage these impacts? I don't know if Karen, if you want to speak to it from the Australian perspective, if there has been consideration.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're not directly
Yes.
involved in that process.
That's
But from what I hear,
Yeah.
there will be more of a focus on the arrangements between counterparties and actually making sure recall processes and the like are working efficiently and effectively to satisfy settlement obligations.
Correct. Yeah. And I think, David, you mentioned about the recall as well impacting securities lending, right?
That's right. I mean, if you know if you've got securities out on loan, and you sell the position that you have, then previously, once that transaction goes through, the custodian potentially has the ability then to recall prior to the settlement taking place, which at T+2 gives you 48 hours to be able to deal with that return of stock. As you move towards T+1, you're taking 24 hours out of that process. So, people have to be running a lot faster to be able to get a securities lending recall if they're waiting for the trade to settle before they do that, or alternatively, they're going to have to be recalling the stock before they take the action to actually sell the position. So there is changes in the process, and that obviously changes the risk profile of the lending program.
Yeah, sounds good. So I believe we're almost at the time. I believe, like at the Oscars, they're gonna kick us off the stage soon. But thanks so much, Karen and David, for a very insightful discussion. Maybe I'll just end off with just summarizing some of the main points I heard. Right. So I think the coordinated approach between Australia and New Zealand, similar to what was done with T+2 a couple of years back, that's quite interesting and quite impactful or efficient. And secondly, David, you raised as well the preparedness of some of the participants, especially the smaller ones. I mean, look, they've got 1 week, right? It's not like there's no time left to get on it. But that's something as well, to a bit of risk in the market if they're not ready, especially the concern about potential higher failed trades. And then lastly, which quite interestingly, I think, Karen, you mentioned that there's a expected higher uplift for moving to T+1 compared to the move to T+2. So that would be, of course, a concern as well to some operations teams when they do that cost benefit analysis. As you said, right, it's a done deal almost, that to move to T+1. It's just when. But so everyone should try to get ready. If it's obviously for the North American migration, if you're an investor in Australia, that will come not very soon, but in a couple of years. And of course, watch this space. ASX will, of course, update their community, or the Australian market will update the community when they make that announcement. Potentially later this year, I believe, right, Karen?
Yes, that's where we're heading.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so I think that's about it. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. Hopefully, you learned something and it was useful. Appreciate the attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.